Hi, everyone. Welcome. And as we're getting started, I want to have everyone introduce themselves in the chat. Just let us know your preferred name, where you're joining from. And if you could answer this question that we have on the screen for you, how does your family or culture cook rice? This is going to come into play later in today's webinar. And I'm going to go ahead and put in my response as well. In my family, we usually cook it on the stove with some water and a little bit of salt and pepper. My husband and I have a Blue Apron recipe thing that we use. We love cooking rice with all sorts of delicious meals. So go ahead and put that in. And as we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Laurel Greene, and I'm one of the education consultants at Britannica. I live in Long Beach, California. A little bit about my background: I'm a former teacher. I've worked in charter schools, in private education, in nonprofit after school programs, doing curriculum development through, I've worked K through 12. And so I'm going to be here really just to support you, and I'll be managing the chat box. So please ask any questions, any other comments or thoughts. And then I'm going to be popping up intermittently to just sort of go through and help facilitate discussion. But I want to introduce you to Jaime Perris, who's going to be your speaker for today. Jaime is an education consultant and curriculum project manager based in New York City, and she's Australian and has lived and worked in 8 countries and traveled to over 30. She's been a teacher for around 15 years and has taught in Australia, South Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, Myanmar, the Bahamas, and the United States. Jaime has worked on government contracts for the US Navy, the Malaysian Ministry of Education, the Taiwanese public prison system in the fields of curriculum development and teacher training. And she recently coached teachers and leaders across New York and New Orleans. And for fun, she loves learning and exploring new cultures, food, and travel, especially the Caribbean. She speaks Chinese and she plays the piano and is really into keeping fit through strength training. So I'm going to pass it over to Jaime, and I'll be here to help you all in the chat. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here and just share this session with you. So thank you for your time. I know it's at the end of the day and a lot of us are tired. So we'll do our best to get through this in the most efficient way. So without further ado, let's introduce you to the topic: culturally responsive instruction in a blended learning environment. So before I move on, I'm just going to stop sharing my video, and same with Laurel, just so we have extra bandwidth and focus on the presentation. So welcome. And just before we begin, we want to go through some community guidelines. And this is just something that is really a good practice that we use with students, whether we're in librarian services or we're educators. It's just something that we have, expectations for everyone. So I'll just give you a moment just to review those guidelines. Okay, and I just want to point out that we do need to exercise self-care during this session. So if you want to go to the bathroom or take a break, go ahead. We do need to practice self-care, especially if we've had a really long day. And I do encourage all participation. This is something that we'd love to model for our students as well. So it's great to get you to participate when I have some fun and engaging activities coming up. So to begin, I have something called the mood meter. So this is checking in with how we feel. So in the chat box, I just want you to pop a number 1, 2, or 3 with which one you most identify with in terms of your feelings and how you feel right now. So just pop that in the chat box, and Laurel will read out what we're getting a lot of right now. I think I'm feeling a number 2, but yesterday was not quite the case. So this can change from day to day.
Well, Jaime, I'm seeing quite a few 3s and some 2s. There's a few 1s in there, but mostly some 2s and 3s. I'm feeling that coffee in an IV as well. I think I need a little bit of coffee here. So I'm agreeing with some people in that way.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And thanks for those that have shared their responses. So this is just something that I encourage that we do with students, just to get a temperature check to see how they're feeling. And it just helps us when we're working with students to gauge where they're at. And that may influence how we approach them when we're relating to them. And I will point out there is also This right here, a Jamboard that I have created, and this is something that you could use with students. There is a code there that you can access, and it's just a really great way. Like, students can be anonymous, they could put where their name belongs and, you know, where they identify with for that day. And it's just something, you know, that just allows them to just share with you where they're at. And I think this is a great thing, especially in the blended learning environment. And you could use this in face-to-face as well. So, okay, so something a little bit more engaging now. So in the chat box, I would really appreciate if you could rate your level of awareness of culturally responsive practices. So if you feel that you're a 0, no knowledge, what are you talking about? You can pop that in. Or if you're feeling limited, number 1, 2, a good amount of knowledge, I'm moving to action, and 3 is a thorough understanding and knowledge, and you use this in your daily practices. So again, we're all coming from a different stage, or we're on a different journey, so it doesn't matter where we're at. I've led a few of these webinars, and trust me, I get a lot of 0s. I barely get any 3s. I get a lot of 2s and 1s. So just put down where you feel that you're at. And then Laurel, just share out what we're getting in the chat box.
We're getting a selection of different responses, but quite a few people saying maybe limited knowledge, or maybe 2, a good amount of knowledge. But there's across the board, we're seeing some people that say maybe they have no knowledge, or even a few people are saying maybe like a 2.5, like they're feeling just a little bit there. So
yeah, and that's a good point, and that's a great thing to keep in mind, that we are coming from different places and we do have a different level of awareness. So just keep that in mind, and it's okay wherever you're at on this scale. And I like that someone said 2.5. I've never got that before. So what are the outcomes? What are we trying to achieve at the end of this outcome? I wish we had days of this, because this is something that I have presented for over months. So it's really hard to condense, but what I do want you to take away from this are 4 main things: some empowerment and inspiration as librarians, or if you have a lead role in the library service field, that you can start to think of ways to facilitate a welcoming, affirming, and inclusive environment. Also challenging you to think about, how can we integrate culturally responsive elements into our curriculum or teaching practice? Now, for librarians or those that are in the library services, how can we set up our environment or our approach to students to make it more culturally responsive? And number 3, what are some strategies and ideas that we can implement that can encourage that student discussion and the dialogue and encourage student voice? So that might be with the books that they encounter, or audiobooks, or things that they may encounter when they visit the library. And the 4th one is an important one for me. I personally think this is extremely important when we're talking about cultural responsiveness. How do we strengthen the cultural connection between educators, whatever role you're in, and your students? So we're going to just talk about 3 pillars, as I like to call them. So we're going to briefly look at defining cultural responsiveness. So what is cultural responsiveness? Then we'll move on to the positive outcomes of culturally responsive practices, and then finally close with some effective strategies that support culturally responsive pedagogy. So as we all know, for the past 1.5 years or so, we've experienced a real change in life, and a new way of teaching, a new way of encountering our students. And across the world, I've included some images here. You could see there's in China and Thailand, they have those very closed off separate spaces. Hong Kong on the bottom, you see a lot of separation there. And then in England, when they eased on their lockdown. And, you know, in Australia, I know that my educator friends have told me that they've gone back fully in person. But then my educator friends in Philippines, they're still on strict remote learning lockdown mode. So it just depends on what part of the world you're in. But you could see on the left here, it varies across the globe, you know, and how we're actually encountering our relationships with our students. So what is culturally responsive. And what does a culturally responsive classroom look like? Well, it does go beyond the classroom wall. So for time's sake, we're not going to do this, but this is just something I thought I would share. It's a strategy that I really love using with students, especially if we're doing, if we're using, online learning means. We can have a QR code that students love to do with their phone. You can scan the QR code. It takes you to a word cloud. And I've called it the Menti word cloud. And what you do is you get to see populated responses of what students say. And the more popular response is a larger font. So what we're going to do, just in the chat box, can you type what you think being culturally responsive means? And while you're doing that, I'll pop up an example of what a Menti word cloud looks like. So Laurel, I don't know if we have anything in the chat box to share, what words?
I'm starting to see some things. And then Jamie, maybe reshare your screen so that we can see stuff. But I'm seeing things like including diverse viewpoints, being patient and open-minded, using our students' daily experiences and backgrounds to inform, shape, and enhance our instruction and assessment, focusing on being empathetic, kind, and understanding, having acceptance. Those are some of the things that people are sharing.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
Jamie, were you trying to share another screen? I just want to be sure.
Yes, I was having difficulties transitioning, but this is what I wanted to share with everyone. Thank you. So as you can see, this is what the Menti word cloud would look like. So you see diversity, multiple perspectives were the more popular responses in a previous webinar that I did. So this is something fun and engaging for our students. So just keep that in mind. And thank you for sharing your responses. They're all correct. So that's great. Okay, I'll just pop back. Okay. So when we look at defining a culturally responsive classroom, you can see that on the top of my screen here, we have multiple terminologies that are used. However, even though these three are the same, multicultural education, which it can sometimes be confused with this term, is quite different. And I will point that out because multicultural education is something very different to social justice education, and there's so many other terminologies out there. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more about cultural responsiveness, Zaretta Hammond is someone that I really look up to in this field. She has a fantastic book on this topic. And I just want to start by saying we have to first understand what culture is. So you can see in this box here that it does encounter so many different things, our beliefs, attitudes, values, goals, and how, like when we're working with students, we have to think about, well, how are we supposed to incorporate all of these elements within culture with one class or with one group of students or at one school, because there's just so many. So don't feel overwhelmed. This is just something to keep in mind, that as we learn that there are different cultures and different elements within each student's culture, it's just something to keep in mind on our approach and when we're working with curriculum and the way we encounter our interactions with our students. And so as Laurel mentioned earlier, I have traveled and lived abroad and taught and coached teachers across the world. So something with my research and my experience, something that I have come up with for culturally responsive teaching is that it's not a strategy, a program, or a single lesson. It's actually a research-based approach that helps students make meaningful connections between what they learn in school and their cultures, languages, and life experiences. And it is a rich, intentional approach woven into every aspect of teaching. So I will highlight that it is not a strategy and program. Some people do think it is that. It's more of an approach. Okay, so let's move on to the second pillar, which is the positive outcomes. What are the positive outcomes of being culturally responsive? So you can see I've listed a few. There are many more than this, but I've highlighted some key outcomes here. It definitely increases student engagement. And I've put there, especially with diverse students with disabilities in inclusive settings. So we're being inclusive of all abilities. Also, academic growth. There is a lot of literature that confirms teachers have that they can have positive impact on the academic growth of minority students if they are sensitive to the cultural characteristics of learners. And I will say, I don't tend to use the word minority. I just like to say inclusive of all students, especially those that may not be focused on, or that are left out in curriculum. So it's inclusive of every student from every cultural diverse background. Also, the third outcome supports children with challenging behaviors. I've been a witness to this. There have been a lot of studies that have been done that students that have had challenging behaviors have seen a significant improvement in behavior when educators have worked in a culturally responsive manner. And also it improves student-teacher peer relationship and connection. And some teachers that I've worked with, especially in the last cohort of this series, shared that they were better equipped with the language, like using the appropriate language to educate other peers, as well as their students in their approach in their teaching as well. So understanding what it means and how to define cultural responsiveness is a really a good thing to help improve relationships with your peers as well as your students. And I really like this quote here. That's why I put it there. It just, again, it focuses on building trust and connection with our students. So let's look at effective strategies for creating a culturally responsive pedagogy. So as you recall, Laurel did mention earlier on the RICE activity. And I will point out that's one of my favorite activities simply because it's one type of food that people from around the world can identify with. When I lived in the Philippines, they cook rice completely different to how my family cook rice. And my parents are from Europe. They cooked it with chicken stock and olive oil and salt, and they, put heavy seasons on it. And as you could see from the responses in the chat box, there are so many different ways to cook rice. And that's just a way to unify students and find some commonality. And you can even adjust this to asking, how does music look in your culture? Or, how do you cook chicken? So you can, change that around as well. And there is a book on this that you can, I don't know, Laurel, if you put it in the chat box yet, that would be great if you could pop that in the chat box for everyone to see. There is a great book that accompanies children and how they go on a journey and explore how different households cook different types of food in a different way. So it's a really great book. So moving along, cultural responsive competencies. Now I've developed 9 with all the research that I have done. It took months of research. So at Britannica, we've made sure that everything is research-based. So we've come up with 9 competencies to base cultural responsive teaching practices on. So you could see there's some really good ones there. And I am going to show you some of the strategies do align to, not all of them because we don't have time, but you'll see how some of these will align. So keeping those competencies in mind, we have developed something called the 5 R's. So when you're looking at your curriculum or the way you approach your students and the way you teach, we're looking at first exploration. So revisiting and examining your curriculum and your practices. Then we look at reevaluating or rethinking your practices. So this is what I like to call critical consciousness. So you're starting to really put on that critical lens and look at how you're actually approaching your teaching practice. Then the tough part, the hard reset. This is where we're looking at revising our curriculum and adopting, keeping things the same, but adopting a more culturally responsive approach in our curriculum. Then finally, re-implementing your curriculum. So we're going to look at these 4 very briefly today. And then in the future, you refine. As you know, in education, it never stops. It continuously grows. We continuously grow and develop in our work. So let's look at the first R, revisiting your curriculum. So this is where we actually ask the hard questions. Okay, where am I? What is the current climate of my curriculum? What voices and perspectives are present? And what are my implicit biases? So we're really looking, we're looking introspectively, and we're exploring ourselves and where we are. And this is something that I highly recommend, Project Implicit. So this is something that was created by Harvard. And what they do is they consider invisible factors and look at things such as, do I have biases with age, race? And you can see, I mean, I've only just captured a few. They have so many there. I took this test and I was shocked with some of my own implicit biases. And it made me think, you know, back in my teaching days, how did that affect the way I interacted with how did it affect the way I interact with my students? Was I more focused at the front? Was I more focused with a particular cultural group more than others? And so it really just got me to take a look inwards. And I've put some key questions there just to challenge you with after this session. Do I have any implicit biases? What do my internal voices sound like? Can I identify every student and their background? And as you could see, I've put a little pie slice there. This aligns to that 9 competency chart I showed you earlier. And this one aligns to the first one, which is reflecting on one's own cultural lens and identify internal biases. So I highly recommend you take that implicit bias test. So creating a welcoming, affirming, and inclusive environment. So this is really exciting for me because it's like, how do we start our school year, or how do we just start to create that inclusive environment? And I like what Ken Shelton said. He said, brave space versus safe space. So this is what we need to focus on, not only in creating a safe space, one of trust, but one where students feel brave and confident to share their ideas and perspectives. And some interesting research, around 80% of the teaching population is white, according to federal data, but our student population is heavily diversified with communities such as Latinas, Latinos, Black and Asians. And this presents problems such as a lack of exposure and lack of cultural understanding. So we really do need to keep this in mind. So I want to pose a question for you. Now that we've defined what culturally responsiveness looks like, we have to look beyond the classroom wall, and we have to ask, what does our environment, what we're surrounding our students with, what does it look like? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like? So I just want you to imagine for a moment, what would it feel like if I told you to erase all of your knowledge, your race, your gender, your cultural background, your life experiences, and your interests? Leave it at the door. What if I told you that? How would it feel? Obviously not good. So this is what many students are expected to do at the door before entering many classrooms, just to leave it all behind. And this is something that is unrealistic as well as unfair, and it ultimately limits our students' scope. So I want you now, for a moment, just reflect on the climate and culture of one of your favorite classes and teachers. I'm sure you can come up with 1 or 2. I know I can as well. So go back in time to an experience with a specific teacher in mind or class, and ask yourself, and you don't need to write in the chat box, just reflect on, how does it look? How does it feel? How do you feel? And what does it sound like? So just reflect on that for a moment. So I'm guessing you felt similar to me in that there was some really positive memories. It may have been the way they were patient with you. I know with my math teacher, he was super patient with me. Math was not my strongest area. I was more of like social studies and art and the creative areas. So he was patient, and he always brought humor into anything that he did. So I felt very welcomed and invited, and I didn't feel excluded. So these are questions that I pose just to get you to feel those feelings and you know, that happy place that hopefully you felt. And I've put some key questions on the bottom. Is it warm, welcoming, and inviting? Were students engaged? Were they happy or tired? And how were the walls? I know with me, I had many teachers had a lot of color and excitement, and they posted students' work on the wall. That made me feel like we were celebrated. And as you could see on the top right corner, that aligns to competency 2, where we're creating that welcoming, inclusive, and affirming environment. And in turn, I will point out that when students feel that, it encourages that open, honest, and respectful discussion, and they feel comfortable to share. Okay, now I'm going to get you to be a little more interactive. So use the chat box. I want you now to reflect on the climate and culture of your classroom environment. So it can be the library environment. So whatever environment that you have control over. So imagine an outsider is looking in to your environment. How does it look? How does it feel? And what does it sound like? So in the chat box, just write some words or a sentence or two, and I'd love to hear your responses to that. So just think about potentially the library space or the school space, and it could be a virtual space. Is it inviting, welcoming, and what are you doing to make it that way? And Laurel, feel free to share anything in the chat box that may come up.
We might still have some people typing a little bit yet. I haven't seen any responses just yet, but I'm sure they're coming in. One person says they're just taking too many notes and that they're really enjoying the presentation. So thank you so much, Adam, for that.
That's some great feedback. Thank you.
So we have someone responding about talking about how being inviting and decorated with rainbows, Maya Angelou quote. Talking about being even uncharacteristically loud in their library and not having it be a quiet space, but focusing on connection, positivity. People are talking about color.
That's great. I love that comment about I'm not about a quiet space. and that doesn't mean that students aren't engaged, right? All that means is that they feel obviously comfortable and could still be on task and engaged with the task, but they feel welcomed and comfortable. So that's great. Thank you for your feedback, everyone. And I will just say, we do need to ask questions. I had some questions just to share. So asking yourself, does my environment, so whatever space you have control over, and the lessons, if you're teaching, you know, if there are lessons that you're teaching, does it reflect my student body or the student population? And how does that environment reflect who my students are? And how will I foster collaboration among my students? So with the chat box comment, you know, that it's loud, like obviously there's some collaboration going on. So how do you foster that? What does that look like? And what can I do to the physical environment to help facilitate collaboration? And it could even be seating. It could be breakout rooms if you have a virtual classroom. And the last final question before I move on, and it's a challenging one, is how would I rate the climate and culture of my class environment? And that's just for you to keep in mind. So rating how you set up your climate and your climate and culture of your class. Okay, so this is another engaging activity, just to make it a little bit more fun. And I love color, so I like this slide. What do you notice here? Pop anything in the chat box. It could be a word, sentences, anything you notice.
So we have some people saying things about being engaging, seeing happiness,
yes, indeed.
inclusivity, collaboration, that people feel like they're cooperating and working together.
Yeah. I like that somebody did mention inclusiveness, and that's something I intentionally put this picture on the top right corner. You see this young boy in the wheelchair, and the way that the class is set up, it's a way to make him feel welcomed. And the same with this circle, you see it's a very inviting space. So the way it's set up, the gallery walk here, a personal favorite of mine, it really allows for students to interact and collaborate. And you see there's a lot of color as well. And it's a very non-traditional setup. And I think this is super important. So being intentional with our grouping as well as our activities in the physical space, I think that is what will really help celebrate students and diversity, and going back to making them feel welcomed and affirmed in the environment. Thanks to COVID, I will say that I am grateful for the digital learning environment. And just like we need to create physical environments that are inviting and welcoming, we need to create inviting digital learning environments. And I've listed a few pointers right here where you could do that through the school website or the library website, the learning platform you use, such as Google Classroom, and providing ESL or ELL support tools, such as text-to-speech, Google Translation tools, and providing accessible information, not just for students, but also for our parents, so they have that interaction with images, links, and any other important information you may want to share. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next R, which is to reevaluate your curriculum. So this is when we're looking at any gaps. So we're identifying gaps in our curriculum. What voices and perspectives are missing in my curriculum? And what areas do I feel need the most attention? Pay particular attention to the voices and perspectives, because that's what I will focus on in the next few slides. So you can see here, I've found a Albert Einstein looking image here. I mean, when I grew up and I did psychology and we did experiments, this was, and even biology and all the other science related subjects, this is the kind of stereotype that I had and a lot of my peers had. And now as an adult, a lot of my teacher peer friends as well still have images that, represent the traditional white scientist with the white lab coat. So the problem here is that it's offering limited voices, limited resource selection. It doesn't encourage students to challenge power and privilege. There's an absence of diverse cultures and perspectives, absence of student autonomy, and it only celebrates main cultural groups' achievements once a year, perhaps. So this is just something to look at to say, am I doing something similar? Do I have an absence or gap in any of these areas? And obviously, we want to be able to go beyond this point here where I said main cultural groups. We want to be able to celebrate multiple cultural groups and their achievements more than once a year. So knowing these gaps, we need to start looking at, okay, how do we revise our curriculum with this knowledge? So this is where we start to look at saying, okay, what do I need to fill in the gaps? And what elements will I include in my curriculum using a culturally responsive lens? So this is where we go to the previous R and say, okay, now that I know the gaps, I have to do a hard reset. It's like, when you buy a cell phone, everything gets wiped out, your pictures, your contents, but you do have your cloud. So you have that foundation. You can reset your phone to when it left the factory, but we need to reset our thinking. We need to put in new images and new, new everything, but we still have the foundation to pull from our iCloud. We don't want to wipe some of the great things that we do have that form our foundation. So we want to do things like this. We want to celebrate underrepresented groups. We want to explore and include different voices and perspectives. And excuse me, and we want to provide students with a different lens. So as you could see in the previous slide, I focused only on the white scientist, the stereotypical, one perspective type of lens. But now we need to take the approach where we don't simply add to the curriculum. We don't just add, celebrations and holidays and maybe one person from one cultural group. We want to do this continuously and integrate a critical lens into everything that we do. So I just want to share a little story with you. A participant from a previous session that I led in this culturally responsive cohort series, he shared his teaching experiences of looking at different scientists around the world, not just the stereotypical white Albert Einstein scientists. And he actually said that. He said that he used multiple scientists. And that's why I put these images along the bottom. So you see here, we're including females, we're including people from different religions, we're including different cultural groups, and it's definitely more inclusive than the previous one that we looked at. So this is a very exploratory type of stage where we're reevaluating, like we already have in the previous stage, but we're revising now. So now we're not just adding to our curriculum where we're just occasionally sprinkling in cultures and their achievements, but we're actually continuously integrating all these inclusive groups that I mentioned. Okay, so now actually, you know what? Sorry, I did want to share something before I forget. It was a really great point with scientists. I did want to point out the transformative lens. So this is where we have to think about how do we transform students' thinking. So they're thinking critically and deeply, and they're touching on the higher order thinking skills. We want them to be curious learners, especially when they have access to books, audiobooks, videos. We want them to be curious and question things and inquire about the unknown. So I did some research on this and found females such as Marie Curie. So she was a Polish-born French physicist and chemist. And I also discovered the Black scientist, Dr. Charles Drew, who was a brilliant pioneering doctor. And he developed so many new methods for storing blood for transfusions and created the first blood bank. And I thought, how interesting was that? And how interesting would that be to share with your students so they could see celebrations from different cultural groups around the world? And more recently, we can infuse current events into this as well, of sharing diverse perspectives and cultures. And I discovered, thankfully, innovators like Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who is an African-American female and one of the National Institutes of Health's leading scientists behind one of the COVID-19 vaccines. And I hope I don't mispronounce this. My Turkish friend said that this is correct. Scientists Uğur Şahin and Özlem Türeci, who are husband and wife, are actually Turkish Germans whose parents were immigrants from Turkey to West Germany, and they actually co-founded the German company BioNTech and partnered with American company Pfizer to found the COVID vaccine. So I was so interested and fascinated. I went down a rabbit hole and I just thought, what an interesting story to share, because they came from immigrant parents and they made something of themselves and became well known to create, one of the COVID vaccines, Pfizer. So sharing stories such as that with your students and, coupling that with cross-cultural experiences, an immigration journey filled with struggle and discrimination, as well as a great opportunity, really can offer inspiration for our students. And it really helps them to celebrate not only diversity, but current events and real issues. And this is really especially important for our marginalized students to be able to see themselves in the books that they read, and they can learn about the lives of others through literature. And ultimately, we want them to feel valued in society. So I had to share that with you. Okay, so re-implement your curriculum. Now, again, I wish I had more time to dive into each of these, but I really, really love this. I cannot talk about this enough. This is something that I found a lot of research based on Dr. James Bank. Amazing, amazing research. So this is something that we need to challenge ourselves, whether it be teachers, librarians, or administrators. We need to take this transformative approach. We need to get here. And ultimately, number 4, this is where I mentioned earlier, like we celebrate, we sprinkle in like Martin Luther King or, Martin Luther King Day or Chinese New Year, once a year type of thing. We're just throwing in occasional holidays. This is where we're adding, I mentioned earlier as well, where we're having a more additive approach where we're just maybe throwing in one scientist that's a little diverse, but the central focus to our curriculum is a Eurocentric one. We don't want to do that. We don't want to have that additive approach. This is where we're trying to go. And Dr. James A. Banks talks about we need to get our students to the point of where their critical lens is getting them to ask those critical questions, to inquire about their learning. And we're introducing celebrations, achievements all the time across all our curriculum consistently. So that's where we really need to strive to getting towards. And then this one, just keeping it simple, is where we actually get students, we challenge students to think, well, now that we've transformed their thinking, help them to transform their thinking with a more critical lens, how do we get them to take action and make decisions? And, maybe they can write to a newspaper or a magazine, and maybe they could be a part of a peaceful protest and be a part of, social activism. So this is where we're getting them to think beyond the curriculum and the textbook and being a part of change. So I know that was very heavy, but that was just a high-level overview. So now, something that I wanted to share with you was how you can integrate cultural responsive instruction through digital learning. Now, I'm going to use this as an example. Britannica has something called launch packs, and it's amazing in that it has 4,000 science and social studies content sets. We've created 20 African American experience bundles, and I'm really excited. We're actually almost there in releasing our Latinx bundle, so that's on its way to being released. And what I really appreciate about these bundles is that they offer student choice and diverse content, which is a very important element in cultural responsive instruction. And a great thing, especially for AL learners or ESL learners, is adjusting the reading level so we can differentiate articles and, such as primary sources for students. They can translate it in over 80 languages. I think last week I counted it was just over 100. Informational text, as I mentioned, primary sources, and a read aloud feature, which is great for those that may not be able to read properly. And so moving on, I wanted to share the Fighting for Equality African American Experience Packs. So here's a quick sneak peek at what they look like. So the whole purpose to these bundles is that they really do cater to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is the first series, as I mentioned, of 20 that we've started. And they include, you can see a teacher guide. It also has a student learning journey right here that guides students through each pack. And it just provides a framework for teachers how to navigate the launch pack. And so the launch packs actually provide an overview of the history of African Americans from their origins in Africa to the continuing effort to gain equality. And so the great thing is every single pack includes an essential question, a resource sequence, supporting questions for each resource, an important vocabulary, and much more. So you can feel free to read more about these bundles. Laurel will put in the chat box a link so you can explore that in your own time. I wanted to move on to this. So going back to those 9 cultural competencies, that pie graph looking diagram, I wanted to show you how I could align these competencies. And this isn't just through launch packs. I'm using launch packs as an example of how you can integrate culturally responsive practices, but you could use this with anything. So for here, I've used an image from launch packs. So you could use any image, but I've used this very intentionally to challenge students to explore this image, reflect and question what they see. So you could ask them things like, okay, what do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? So the see, think, wonder strategy is wonderful. You could also ask follow-up questions such as, do you see yourself in this picture? Why? Or why not? Or how? And this question draws on the competency of students' cultures and experiences, and it draws on things such as acceptance of race, hairstyles, dress, demeanor, economic, social status, and so much more. And the whole purpose that I put here on the bottom was we want them to explore, challenge, and think deeply. So that's the competency, as I mentioned. So moving on to this one. So this next competency, before I move on, keep in mind any experiences that you can share with your students that connect with your content. So for example, I traveled to Egypt and I had a really great historical cultural encounter. If I was still teaching, I would share that video with my students and share with them what I learned, what I discovered, what interested me, and then I would pose questions to them as well. So a question that I have for you, especially being in library services, is, am I intentional about my book selection? What books and resources am I showing students? And you can see here, I've included pop culture, comic books, and entertainment. So many students really connect with comic books. And the virtual field trips, something I did mention the Egypt tour, but something that a lot of students where I'm based in New York, they don't get out of the boroughs of Brooklyn or the Bronx or wherever they are. So bring it to them, bring a virtual field trip to them. And this is a great video that I found of a teacher who led her own little tour through the African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is another great one of Machu Picchu. Absolutely amazing. And it felt like I was really there. Even though I've been to both in person, it did a great job of capturing for students, some of the amazing historical elements and cultural elements. And again, the competency that we're focusing on here is embedding a range of culturally rich materials that reflect inclusivity, multiple perspectives, celebrations and achievements across diverse populations. So yes, and this one here, so now we're looking at real world issues and current events. There is so much out there. I've just provided not even a glimpse of some, but there are so many amazing articles. These came from the New York Times. National Geographic is another great source that has real world issues and current events that you can incorporate alongside books or whatever curriculum that you're using. And the amazing thing about this is that it goes back to what I was sharing earlier about the last level, what we're trying to get to students, is that social activism and what they can do now that they have that transformative lens. So students have the opportunity, when they read articles on current events, they can share their voice. They can have a discussion, debate, they could write a letter to government, or they could be part of the solution to create a social justice campaign. And they can even create their own video and have meaningful conversations. And so having said that, that meets that competency there. So you could see we're naturally aligning to these important culturally responsive competencies. This is one of my favorite ones right here. I absolutely love talking about this competency, and I'm going to show you a video in a moment. So this is where we look at images, and this was taken from the launch packs that I shared with you, the African American Experience Bundle that I showed you earlier. You can use spoken word. I love spoken word poetry, and you can be intentional about it. I have a female who speaks Spanish. I have a Muslim female. I have an African American who speaks about his experiences and hardships growing up. So student voice and autonomy, this is something where students love to be represented. And if you integrate that into your curriculum through the use of video, images, and other resources, it's a really great way, a channel for their identity, culture, and personal experiences to come through. And it promotes student voice. So what I will do, I will pause this screen and take you to sit back and relax and watch a video. And I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you.
Jamie, are we supposed to?
Sorry, yes, one
small
second.
minds, and maybe I am an Oreo.
Apologies, one second.
Funny how we eat the black cookie.
Don't you just love technology? You can have it perfectly set up and then it just doesn't go as planned. Okay, can you all see that? Laurel, is that all good now?
We can see it.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Okay, so sit back and relax and just watch this 1 minute or so video.
You called me an Oreo, and since then I've been inclined to believe so. My white thought and brown skin confused your small minds, and maybe I am an Oreo. Funny how we eat the white icing and leave the black cookies. They grow stale, bitter, and crack. How you take my white brain, my white speech, my white delicacy, and leave my black shell of a body, and I grow stale. I feel bitter, and now I'm about to snap. You called me an Oreo, and so now I call you ignorant. You call me an Oreo, and I paint myself educated. I paint myself beautiful. You call me an Oreo, and I paint myself powerful. And if that's what you depict when you call me an Oreo, then maybe I am one.
Okay, so thanks for watching that. So that's something I just wanted to share with you as a way to close up. That was something that Britannica asked high school students, what's your story? How is your identity shaped by the stories you tell about yourself through media? And that's what one of our students came up with. And you can see these are the two competencies that we align to. So another thing is you can use student breakout rooms if it's virtual or even in your library. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so as we wrap up, I would really appreciate if in the chat box you could share 1 to 2 strategies or takeaways that you can hopefully use immediately. I really look forward to seeing hopefully some strategies that you could use. Hopefully you have something that you could take away with you. So as Laurel, I'll keep an eye on the chat box, and I guess we will, oops, apologies. I guess we will move on to the next slide, and you can take it from there, Laurel. Oh, sorry, before I go on, Laurel, take a screenshot. This is great. Here are some of my recommendations. This is the one I mentioned earlier about Zaretta Hammond, and I'm currently reading this one now, actually with Laurel and a group at Britannica, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Fantastic read. So there are some recommendations. Okay, over to you, Laurel. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. So you'll be receiving a follow-up email after this session. And if you'd like to request information about access to a free trial of Launch Packs and the AAE bundles that we have, please reach out to Beth. I'm going to put her contact in the chat box here for you all so that you have that. And she will be able to follow up with you on that. And then can I have you go ahead and switch over to the next slide for me when you can, Jamie? And then if you're interested in learning more about our culturally responsive instruction cohorts and how to implement them in your school or participate in that, we have a 4-part workshop that runs over 3 months. In each session, you'll be part of a small group discussion. There'll be time to reflect on your practice, and you'll be provided with many tools, resources, as well as applications to use with the students. And then through that, you'll receive 6 hours of CEUs. And here are what the things that are going to be covered across those 4 different sessions.
And on that note, thanks, Laurel, for sharing that. That is the end of the session, and I'm glad we kept it before 4 o'clock. That is great. It took many years of practice in the teaching world. So we will stay here for a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
Hi, everyone. It's Joy piping in again. We actually only have 3 minutes left in the presentation slot. So if there are any questions that you all have in these last 3 minutes, you can type them into the chat, or you can ask to raise your hand, or you can raise your hand and ask to be ask your question aloud. but I'm not seeing any additional questions. You're able to email Jamie and her team following the conference with any additional questions that you may have. And as I mentioned in the chat box, these slides will be available on the SCED website, and the recording of this presentation will be available later. So I want to go ahead and thank Jamie and her team for being here this afternoon and helping to close out the 2021 Galileo Annual Conference. I appreciate you all being here, and thank you all to the attendees who came as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Joy. And thank you everyone for participating and reading the comments in the chat box. I appreciate all your wonderful words and glad that there are some strategies that you could take away. So feel free to reach out, and thank you so much.